This meeting is being recorded.
All right, everyone, we'll get started. Thank you for joining tonight. We might have some more people jump in, but we had a pretty big night on Tuesday as far as people joining, so I think a couple people are back, so thank you. Oh, that was Mr. Stan. All right, Mr. Stan, I have muted you for the time being, because your computer was bringing it back.
I had both my phone and my computer muted.
I don't know, it's weird because I saw your name light up when all that noise was going on. So, I'm not sure what happened. But anyway, it's all good. It's all good in the hood. Okay, all right, so we'll get started. One thing, Tim did send out something on Wednesday or Tuesday night about the SOC stuff. I did fix that, and I did update it with some good knowledge that he hadn't mentioned, just so it was more clarity, because we talked about it that night, and there was a little bit of information that I've left off of there, and I want to make sure I clarify that. So we'll clarify that at the end for sure, but we'll go ahead and get started so we have everything going. All right, now we're going to get through Chapter 1. I know that Chapter 1 was pretty, I took 3 weeks to get through it, but there's a lot of data in there that really needed to be gone over. And I want to make sure that everybody understood those principles because they are going to come in play later as we get into this. So just, realize that as we go through these things, some of them will be faster, some will be slower, but I want to make sure you understand the core concepts of everything, okay? And again, if you have questions or follow-up stuff, please ask at the end or during, or email me, whatever you'd like to do, so we make sure we cover it for you. All right, security policies and threats. All right, we're going to get into some understandings of the security policies first, and realize that the latter three in this list, really, you're going to see those in the main security policy, but I want to make sure I highlight them because sometimes you go to organizations that might just have them broken out separately, okay? All right. So security policy is a document that defines the overall scope of security needed by an organization and discusses the assets that require protection and the extent to which security solutions should go to provide the necessary protection. Security policy in some organizations can be a general overview, not necessarily ingrained or detailed, and that's when you'll see, most of the time you'll see those broken down by the three latter ones here, which are organizational, issue-specific, and system-specific. You could consider this, you'll see sometimes somebody will ask me for a copy of security policy or some sort of security statement. I consider that kind of what they're referring to here as a security policy, kind of a high-level overview. It doesn't really get too detailed. But overall, security policy should be detailed and get everything you need in it. An organizational security policy focuses on issues relevant to every aspect of an organization. This is more encompassing than just general security policy, as I kind of mentioned before. An issue-specific security policy focuses on a specific network service, a department, a function, or other aspects that is distinct in the organization. A system-specific security policy focuses on individual systems, servers, phone systems, operational systems. Could be smart station, could be dealing with stuff from National Financial, Wealthscape, I think it is. This focuses on in those systems that prescribes approved hardware and software, outlines methods for locking down a system, and even mandates firewall or specific security controls. We're going to get into baselines and standards here in a little bit, but just so you know, to lock down a system, a lot of these security policies will have, standard, best security practices that you go in to harden those systems, right? And that's where you're going to really see those detailed in the system-specific security policies. Three categories of security policies. Regulatory policy, required whenever an industry or legal standards are applicable. to the organization. This policy discusses regulations that must be followed and outlines procedures that should be used to elicit compliance. Now, I had Tracy in here on Tuesday night, and he's probably falling asleep a little bit, but when it comes down to this side of the house, the regulatory side, this policy, while it might not stand out as its own policy within our organization, you can consider this, legal stuff like FINRA, SEC, New York DFS. You could even consider this, some of the SOX controls type of situations. An advisory policy discusses behaviors and activities that are acceptable and defines consequences of violations. Most of these policies are advisory in nature, of course, explain senior management's desires for security and compliance within the organization. You might consider an advisory policy to be something like a user acceptance policy, which is on our next slide, just as some reference. An informative policy designed to provide information or knowledge about specific subjects such as company goals, mission statements, or how the organization interacts with partners and customers. Policy provides support, research, and background information relevant to specific elements of the overall policy. This can go into where it kind of dives deeper into a particular topic, right? What makes a good policy? They are clear and concise and understandable. You want to make sure on the universal interpretation side that everybody understands it, right? You don't want to take a policy to somebody that they read through it and they're totally confused about what it is, and then that means they're not going to follow it, right? You want to make sure that it's able to be understood and able to be followed. They are relevant to business, current and not obsolete. There's nothing worse than having policies that you have in your WSPs or whatever they may be that are obsolete, they're old, and they're not followed, right? I mean, because one thing, a regulator can come back, or even a third-party audit that could come in and say, you know what, you've got all these policies that you're not following. We're like, oh, well, that thing's like 5 years old. Of course we're not following it. Well, you shouldn't have it inside of your system. Those things should be destroyed so that they are not visible anymore, because it causes confusion. You want to make sure policies are enforceable and doable. And union management backing, TK and Phil and all those guys have to approve these things, and they have to push these things, right? They have to make the population aware that they have to follow these things, and if not, one, they're not enforceable. Two is that people will be like, oh, well, I don't have to follow this because management is not pushing it. It's Aaron pushing it over here. Got to make sure they're easily accessible. This would be like having it on a portal, making sure that you direct people via email to this side of the portal or to the external site where they might be hosted. Our written supervisory procedures, for example, are hosted by another provider, and the link that's on our portal goes out to that provider. So making sure that they know where those are is important. Make sure they are applied fairly and consistently. Applies to management, right? Unless the policy has exceptions. Well, we always want to make sure management is always following the same policies that we're following, right? If not, again, if management's not following, why do I have to follow it? And if people could use that as a bias, HR could probably have a field day with those kind of things, right? If we were to say, oh, well, we're going to, somebody's job position could get eliminated because they didn't follow these policies or they broke the policies. Well, if they weren't applied fairly, then they could bring up that argument, right? That management was following it. Why do I have to? So we've got to make sure that management is backing it and they are following it. Policies should be stable and enduring, long-term focus. Goal whenever we're writing these policies is to make sure that we're thinking about, okay, where are we going to be 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now? Are these things that we foresee still applicable in that time frame? If not, then maybe we need to change it, or we need to make sure that one that we're reviewing them regularly, but make sure that every time we look at these things or while we're writing them, that we're trying to forecast how they're going to look in the long term and how they will adapt with the company. Policies should have consequences if violated, right? They should give an incentive to follow. Carrot on the stick is a good example. It may be recognition. It may be, whatever it may be. If somebody called out something that, broke a policy that may be running the company that we're unaware of, it could be a system that we're just not aware of. Well, we might find some way to reward them for that. I'm not sure what that might be, but you always want to make sure that you give them a reason that is appetizing to them to follow it. All right, acceptable use policy is a commonly produced document that is specifically designed to assign security roles within the organization as well as ensure the responsibilities tied to those roles. Part of that is job descriptions. We want to make sure that in our job descriptions we are calling out what people should be doing in regard to security. It's important to start there so they understand. And in the employment agreement, that they're accepting that user policy, right? This policy is defined as levels of acceptable performance, expectations of behavior and activity. Failure to comply could be job warnings, penalties, or termination. I think one thing that's kind of, the same across all of our acceptable user policies that we had when we came together was, make sure people aren't using these things to, break laws, cause a danger to someone else, cause a danger to our information. These are things that are not, acceptable, or, going to porn sites, going to wasting time, going to, whatever it may be, Facebook, whatever, and wasting time at the job when they should be working. All right, procedures. I called these 4 out down here, and I really kind of put statements beside them that you need to know, okay? So whenever you think about procedures, think about step-by-step required actions, right? Standards. Hardware, software, and other documents to be deployed universally through the organization. You want to standardize on hardware. You want to standardize on software. You want to standardize on a type of document. It could be a form, could be some sort of, HR form, to bring some, to enroll somebody into the company, those kind of things. Baselines. Baselines are minimum security implementations for specific platforms or environments. You can think about this in regard to best practice. I guess you say best practice analyzer could go between baselines and guidelines, but Microsoft used to have a best practice analyzer on their server platforms, which really set a minimum level of security for that system, depending on what its function was. Guidelines. The main thing in the guidelines is best practices, okay? Guidelines are best practices, but they're also recommendations, suggestions, and advice. All right. I drew this so that you understand that policies are the overall arching architecture of your security components, right? Policy is where it starts. Can't have standard baselines and guidelines and procedures without policies that start that interaction and, lay the groundwork, right? So policies are at the top, standards, baselines the next level, guidelines, procedures, right? We start with policies. The rest of them come down and help us create that flow. Threat modeling. Threat modeling is a process by which potential threats can be identified, enumerated, and prioritized, all from an attacker's point of view, right? So we are looking at possible potential threats inside of our environment that we can find and try to understand them from an attacker's point of view. How would they exploit that threat? What would happen if they exploited that threat? Threat modeling can be performed as proactive measure during the design and development phase. It can also be performed as reactive measure once a product has been deployed. Security development lifecycle. You normally see this as SDLC. The book calls it out as SDL, but I wanted to make sure you saw it as SDLC because that's how I normally see it. Okay? It's a process to consider and implement security at each stage of the product's development. As we get further into the book, mainly at the end, software-defined lifecycle is going to really be at the end. It's a whole chapter. You have the waterfall model. You have the agile model. we got a few others, right? So we'll get to that later, but just realize that software-defined lifecycle, security development lifecycle is kind of the same thing. You're going to see the acronym for both, but it's considered creating a lifecycle of evolution to where you create a project, security, you get to the end, or software, you get to the end of it, and at the end you're maintaining it, and then you could replace it at some point and start the cycle all over again. SD3 plus C. Secure by design, secure by default, and secure in deployment and communication. It has two goals: to reduce the number of security-related design and coding defects, and to reduce the severity of any remaining defects. The main thing about development, when it comes to security at least, is to make sure that you are developing security into the product rather than waiting till it's developed and then coming back in. It's going to cost you more time and more money in the end. Again, here we go, proactive approach. Proactive approach to threat modeling takes place during the early stages of development, specifically during the initial and specification establishments. This is the defensive approach, usually more cost-effective and successful as compared to a reactive approach. Reactive to threat modeling takes place after a product has been created and deployed. This is an adversarial approach, usually the core concept of ethical hacking, pen testing, code review, and fuzz testing. Usually costs more in the long run, not just money, but also time. Quick note about fuzz testing. We'll get into this when we get into attacks and some other things, but it's a weird term. Most people don't know, so I want to make sure I called it out. Specialized dynamic technique that provides many different types of input to software to stress its limits and find previously undetected flaws. It supplies invalid input, either randomly generated or specifically crafted to trigger known software vulnerabilities. I'm going to give you an example of you're filling out a PDF or you're filling out a registration on a website and asks for your date of birth or your phone number. The fields that are in there that you're typing that data into should only accept data in the correct format that it expects. It should not allow you to type in a 25-digit social security number, right? Because if you're able to type that 25-digit social security number, that doesn't really exist, right? You're actually running that rest of that data outside of that main set of real social security bits. You're running that over the buffer, which could create a buffer overflow situation, which could drop those bits of data, those numbers of digits, into the back-end infrastructure of that database, which would cause corruption, right? So that is overall what buffer overflow does. You're going over the buffer zone. The area that's in that field that it's expecting is your buffer, and anything over that is written is the overflow. Okay? So we'll get into that more in detail later, but realize that you want to make sure that whenever you design something, you only allow it to take in what you expect it to take in that field. You want to make sure it's restricted to that. And that's where fuzz testing comes in, to where you can use the software to fuzz test against it, and it'll randomly try to throw stuff in there and see if it fails. All right, approaches to threat modeling. It can be focused on assets. This is a method that uses asset valuation results and attempts to identify threats to those valuable assets. If the asset hosts data, access controls can be evaluated to identify threats that can bypass authentication and authorization mechanisms. It could be focused on attacks. Some organizations are able to identify potential attackers and can identify the threats they present based on the attacker's goals. A challenge with this approach is that new attackers and new attacks can appear that weren't previously considered a threat. I mean, we had this kid, Black Hat in DEF CON this year. He was 11 years old. He hacked right into a voting terminal, right, from his laptop. There are new ones. There's new threats and new threat actors born every day, right? So we have taken in mind when we're looking at focusing on attacks that those attacks are going to change and they're going to multiply drastically from one day to the next. So that might be a limited purview way of looking at threat modeling. Focused on software. If an organization develops its own software, it can be considered a potential threat against the software. This would be, metrics, team, our data warehouse that we have, right? We develop those things, and we have to try to build security into those things as we're going through the development cycle, right? So if you look at those and you're looking at vulnerability assessments against that software, it will help you to understand the possible threats against it. The ultimate goal of threat modeling is to prioritize the potential threats against the organization's valuable assets, right? So we always base threats, when we're talking about threats, we always measure them against how much value they have to us. And a lot of that will come in the next chapter, I believe, or the chapter of that as we're how to classify a cost number or a, qualify, certain high level, low valuation to them. Stride. Microsoft developed a threat categorization scheme known as Stride threat model. It is often used to assess threats against applications or operating systems. As you see, they're spelled out to the left-hand side here. S stands for spoofing, which is an attack with the goal of gaining access to a target system through the use of falsified identity. We all know about spoofing. Tampering. And any action resulting in unauthorized changes or manipulation of data, whether in transit or in storage. Tampering is used to falsify communications or alter static information. Such attacks are a violation of integrity and availability. Repudiation, we mentioned this about 2 weeks ago. We're going to get more about it. You're going to see repudiation, non-repudiation several times. But repudiation in this situation is the ability of a user or attacker to deny having performed an action or an activity. Repudiation attacks can also result in innocent third parties being blamed for security violations they didn't do. Information disclosure, the distribution of private, confidential, or controlled information to an external or unauthorized entities. Denial of service attacks, DOS, DDoS, an attack that attempts to prevent authorized use of resources. If you don't really understand DOS attacks or DDoS attacks, think about it as, we got these machines sitting out there that have been taken over by some sort of malware, and they have a particular target in mind that they're going to target, right? And they're going to continue to send ping packets to it. They're going to try to flood it with emails. They're going to flood it with anything they can to hopefully either shut the system down or make it to where its resource over, its memory, CPU load or something takes it out of commission for a time to where those buffers come down. Could be seconds, could be minutes, could be hours, or it could be a full shutdown where you could actually corrupt the OS. It just depends on what kind and what they're trying to do. Elevation of privileges. You're going to see this more likely to be escalation of privileges later in the book. So just realize that when you're looking at that. An attack where a limited user account is transformed into an account with greater privileges, powers, and access. Good example recently is we had our internal pen test done. Well, we let the guy inside, right? We put a box internally to the network, and we gave him no account information. But he was able to sniff out certain, through LMDS and an old version of NetBIOS, able to sniff out requests going over our network and that had hashes in it of passwords. And he was able to tie those hashes to a particular username as it was going through the authentication process and was able to use those to gain access to our network and actually elevate his privilege to full admin. Dread. Stride, then dread. As I said, as you'll see in the first sentence, dread is used to prioritize severity of threats after you identify those threats in Stride. Damage, how bad would the attack be? Reproducibility, how easy is it to reproduce that attack? Exploitability, how much work is it to launch the attack? Affected users, how many people would be impacted by this attack? And discoverability, how easy is it to discover this threat, right? So after we kind of figure out what we think are those threats over here in Stride, we're going to come over to Dread and try to figure out evaluation to them. Pasta. Now this is a new one that I never saw until I really started going back through this thing. It wasn't in my boot camp and it wasn't in something else, so I definitely want to go over it and make sure you note it because you might see this if you ever do go to take a test. PASA is a risk-centric approach that aims at selecting or developing countermeasures in relation to the value of the assets to be protected. It is a 7-stage threat modeling methodology. Each stage has a specific list of objectives to achieve and deliverables to produce in order to complete the stage. Stage 1, definition of the objectives for the analysis of risk. Stage 2, definition of the technical scope. Stage 3, application, decomposition, and analysis. Stage 4, threat analysis. Stage 5 is weakness and vulnerability analysis. Stage 6, attack modeling and simulation. And Stage 7 is a risk analysis and management. Now, I haven't really seen this on test. I didn't see it on practice tests, so take note of it. You might see it again. Just refer to this if you do. So it's probably good to memorize a lot of this stuff because it will come back. Here's a good life cycle map to show you how PASA kind of lays itself out. You know, kind of go through the 7 stages again, but as you see, you have to complete one stage before you move on to the next stage, and so forth. Trike and vast. These are 2 other terms that I have not seen until this new book. Okay, so I started out with 2015 version, went through the boot camp and stuff of that nature. I didn't see these, right? So call them out. They could be new things they're going to throw in the test, so just be aware of them. Trike, a threat modeling methodology that focuses on a risk-based approach instead of depending on the aggregated threat model used in Stride and Dread. Trike provides a method of performing security audit in a reliable and repeatable procedure. It also provides a consistent framework for communication and collaboration among security workers. It is used to craft an assessment of acceptable level of risk for each class of asset that is then used to determine appropriate response actions. FAST, visual, agile, and simple threats. A threat modeling concept based on agile project management and programming principles. The goal is to integrate threat and risk management in the agile program environment on a scalable basis. We'll get more into agile as we go through the book. It's not mentioned a whole lot, but it's definitely mentioned in that software-defined software lifecycle. So you'll see it again. All right, diagramming to reveal threat concerns. So what we did here is we really came in and I wanted to show you that there's a relation to when you break down a process or you break down a system. Looking at a server and you look at all the external things that it talks to. In this particular situation, you've got a user here that's trying to access the data that's in this database, right? So that user accesses the serverlet, which is maybe a front end, right, or something of that nature, through this login request that allows him into that, and which then this login process, okay, I know who this person is, it's got the right access, so we're going to give him access, and then this web page feeds in and says, okay, all right, he's allowed to see this. Now it's going to call data from this database, right? And then the database is going to come back through and hand off that database to the server applet, so that the web applet, so the user can see it, right? We want to make sure that we create those boundaries of knowledge so that whenever we come back through and we're designing things, that we properly understand how the data flows. If you don't understand how the data flows in a product that you have stood up, you have potential for security flaws that are present, and you need to be aware of those. There'll be more on this later, by the way. You'll see this diagram again. All right, reduction analysis. What you just saw was an image of reduction analysis. Reduction analysis is the next step of threat modeling. It also is known as decomposing the application, system, or environment. Again, breaking it apart to understand how the data flows. The first is to gain a greater understanding of the logic of the product as well as its interactions with external elements. Okay, Outlook is your application. Exchange, Office 365 is your back end. Understanding how that communication works and how that secure communication works with TLS, how those different protocols work, SMTP, POP3, IMAP. Having a good understanding of that is kind of how we're breaking this down. You're breaking the identified sub-elements down to be evaluated in order to understand its inputs, processing, security, data management, storage, and outputs. In the decomposition process, you must identify 5 key concepts. What are the trust boundaries? Any location where the level of trust or security changes, of course. What are the data flow paths? That movement between those locations. The input points could be a field in a website, could be a username, password, where that external input is received. Privilege operations, any activity that requires greater privileges than as a standard user account or process, typically required to make changes or alter security. And the details about security stance and approach. The declaration of the security policy, security foundations, and security assumptions. Right? So we're going to have all 5 of these in there when we're going through this decomposition. Right? We're going to go through this thing, and we're going to break it out, and we're going to see what each of these are and how they interact and what the whole purpose is. Are they secure? Are those secure channels of communication? All right, here's our boundaries. All right, these red lines are our boundaries. So that's where we expect that privilege management or the privilege of that user to change, right? This is an unidentified user. We've gone through here, gone through the authentication process. We know that that user is authenticated and does have access to that said bank account or whatever, or to that exchange account, and then the data is processed back through to where the user can see that data, right? So we know that it went from an unidentified user to an identified user that is authorized, right? Any questions on that? All right, cool. All right. Risk prioritization. We're going to scrap this middle one. I don't know why I didn't take it out today when I was going through it. I don't really like it, but we'll take it on. Okay, so risk prioritization, failure modes, and effects of analysis. Examples of this, threats may be, your road trip to the beach. I threw something simple up there that we could all kind of figure out. Scale of 1 to 10 is how we use this as a basic ranking. Could be 1 to 100, 1 to 1,000, depending on what you've got and what you want to do. The higher the risk number, the greater the concern. And again, this helps you prioritize the threats and know which ones to address first. So in the instance of a flat tire, right? Well, if we're driving down the road and we're going to the beach, right? Well, that could be bad. That could be a bad impact. So we're going to give it a 10, right? What's the likelihood of it happening? Well, if I went to the tire shop and I just got checked out, well, hopefully it's low, so we're going to say a 2 here. What's the inability of control to detect this in a certain amount of time? Well, we've already been to the tire shop. We know the tire's pretty good shape, so we don't expect any crazy stuff like a blowout or a belt breaking in the tire. But one thing we may not be able to figure out is a nail, right? A nail could pop up. So, all right, so we know the chances are kind of low, so we're going to give it a 3. So you multiply these factors together, and that gives us your risk score. All right? Now we'll go to the run out of gas scenario. Well, I use this as a basis because I used to have a 79 LTD, right? Well, tell you what, the gas gauge was broken the day I bought it for $800, but you know what? It was a tank, and I had to guesstimate how much gas I had in there, right? So I used this as an example. So severity of impact, well, I've got caught in 2 a.m. in the morning, right, without any gas, so I'll put that as a 10. What's the likelihood of that happening? Well, hopefully, if I was using my mind properly, then, hopefully it's kind of low, and I make sure every other day I load a little bit of gas in there at least. So we'll keep it as 2. The inability to detect it in time, well, that could be 1, right, depending if the gas gauge actually worked or not, right? So we'll give it a 1. I want to give you something different here as far as the lower numbers so you see what it was. But again, you multiply the numbers together to get your risk score. In this case, we're going to go with the higher risk score, and we're going to address this flat tire situation first before we address our running out of gas situation. We're going to put our money and our resources and our time into fixing the flat tire problem instead of, or the chance of the flat tire problem, instead of us running out of gas situation. Things that this could be, we could look at here is our patches, right? We know our patches are behind internally, right? We know that we have a problem there. So to us, that might be a higher risk priority number by the time we look at it, and we're going to dump our time and resources into that. Well, the overarching problem of that really is the fact that we have no storage and compute in the back end, right? So that number is higher, so we're going to focus on getting that storage compute, and that's going to be the highest level. The patches are going to come in the second level. All right, on to evaluating third parties. Now, I'm not sure of how many of you have to do this or had to have done this work for the company or other companies, but in part of compliance is we have to go out and we have to make sure that we are essentially documenting that we have these third parties, they have security controls in place. Well, this is becoming over and over again thing where it's getting a higher and higher concern on regulators' mindsets, law enforcement's mindset. So we also need to be aware of it and try to have stronger procedures in place for regulating these third parties. When engaging third-party assessment and monitoring services, keep in mind that external entity needs to show security mindedness in their business operations. If an external organization is unable to manage their own internal operations on a secure basis, how can they provide you with reliable security, right? Or those security management functions that you're looking for. When evaluating third-party security integration, consider the following processes. On-site assessment. Should you go visit them and find out what they actually have? Or, they may claim to be this big shop and we got good reference to stuff, but then we show up at their place and it's a small mom and pop shop and they have nobody to really deliver those services that they said they could deliver. So an on-site assessment might be required. Document exchange and review. Investigate the means by which data sets and documentation of incidents and responses are reviewed. Make sure that they are documenting these situations and make sure that you can show proof that they have fixed these situations if they did have problems. Policy review. Request copies of their security policies, process, procedures, and documentation of incidents and responses for review. Again, you're looking at, things they may have been audited against, things that they may have found that were incidents, and making sure that you are following up on those and make sure that they followed up. Not you followed up, make sure they followed up on them and fix the problems. Third-party audit. Having an independent third-party auditor can provide an unbiased review of an entity's security infrastructure based on service organizational control or SOC reports. Okay, so this is Deloitte is a big company that does this. Markham is our company that does this for us. They created unbiased. We do have our own internal audit, right? But having that third-party audit company is very important, especially when you're a public company like us. Evaluating third parties. All right. Statement of Standards for Attestation Engagement, SSAE, is a regulation that defines service organizational control reports, SOC reports, right? So SSAE is the regulation that defines those SOC reports, and we are currently at level 18, which became effective May 1st, 2017, which replaced version 16. SOC reports are typically performed on an annual basis. I know if you were involved, I got the email yesterday requesting SOC 1 reports from some of our vendors. So that's an annual basis that we have to attest to or have them attest to, and then we have to supply that to our auditors. SOC 1 reports are focused on financial reporting controls, okay? These are very important. You are going to see these again on several occasions, so make sure that you understand what these are. SOC 2 reports on controls at a service provider in regards to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. at a service provider or data center, First Clearing, National Financial, those kind of people. This report contains a description of auditors' tests and results. This report is restricted to regulators and the company's management team. You don't give this to the public whatsoever. SOC 3 reports are the same as SOC 2, but all the details of the controls and the tests have been removed. This is basically the public seal of approval from the auditor and can be used for marketing purposes. Microsoft saying they've got so many 99s of availability, right? Well, they've had to perform SOC 2 report to state that they have these availabilities, and then the auditor comes back and puts the stamp approval on there and says, yes, you can use this in your marketing. A Type 1 and Type 2. Both SOC 1 and SOC 2 reports have the two types. Okay? Very important. Type 1 confirms the controls do what they're designed to do. However, when the auditor is looking at it, he's only looking at a point in time, today. Okay? SOC 1 is today, right? Remember that. Type 2 contains the same info, but adds the results of testing and monitoring the controls to show how effective they are over time. I can't see with this thing. Monitor for a period of time. This could be a month. It could be 3 months. It could be 6 months. More than likely, you're going to see it for a month cycle or a quarterly cycle, okay? So make sure you understand the Type 1 and Type 2 differences. Type 1, point in time. Type 2, a period of time. All right, that's the end of this week. Short course. We got through Chapter 1. Again, I want to make sure you understand this stuff because it's going to come up again, and I want to make sure you're ready for it and make sure you have a good understanding of it. Anybody got any questions, thoughts, concerns?
I don't have any questions.
Okay. All good? Well, thank you, everyone. Good. Everything will be shared out today. Tomorrow morning probably, because it'll take a little bit for the video to get uploaded. But if you're outside of the B. Riley Wealth Tenant, I will post it to YouTube, and I will have those links in the email as well to the YouTube channel. Okay. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you again. By the way, I'm not here tomorrow. I'm getting sheetrock on Saturday. I'm going to be reorganizing my living room tomorrow. So I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Thanks, Aaron. Have a good night.
Aaron, you all have a good night. Bye.
Good night.
Multiple people are now exiting. Unknown participant is now exiting.